I'm Nathan Savant. I'm a narrative designer who focuses on expressing personality through gameplay. I've spent the last 2 years designing voice powered AI conversations at a startup called Artie. I'm also a former student of CalArts character animation, where I learned all sorts of techniques for storytelling and conveying character from the experts of Disney and Pixar. Learning from them is what led me to narrative design and is what I'm here to talk about today. Today, I'm going to talk about the 3x structure, the concept of through lines, Pixar's formula, and how to smack all those things with a hammer until they're in tiny, tiny pieces that we can use to conquer all of time. Hopefully, that sounds interesting to you. Also, please note, this is the first time I'm ever giving a talk, so I apologize for any of my roughness. So, to get going, I want to ask you a question. What is the purpose of linear time? Basic question, I know. But I want you all to keep that in mind as we go on this journey together, and we'll circle back to that in a bit. First, let's lay some foundation. This is a talk about adapting film's techniques to nonlinear games. So, what are film's techniques? Look familiar? The 3-act structure is a particular framework that works for some stories and is generally a pretty useful thing to know about. 4 and 5-act structures are also useful. Let's be honest, your story could use 437 acts as long as it serves some purpose within your writing. Leave your dreams, folks. So, what's actually useful here are the vertical lines. They represent story beats, those particular moments that are in some way notable and which ultimately lead your story forward into whatever distant horizon your heart yearns to send it. This chart is, notably, two-dimensional. Along the x-axis is linear time, and the y-axis represents intensity. Good story will grow more intense over time until a final climax that will release all the built-up tension. So the goal of this graph is simply to chart intensity over time. Keep that in mind. We'll come back to it. The other major element of film storytelling is the concept of a through line. A through line is exactly what it sounds like, a line that goes through your whole story. There are several of these through lines. Each of them focuses on a particular aspect of the story, and they break down into 4 major categories. There's your protagonist through line, the story of what the protagonist is experiencing directly and how they are affected by it. There's the relationships through line, the story of how whatever the protagonist is dealing with affects the people around them. There's the opposition through line, the story of how what the protagonist is dealing with is affecting and being affected by the actions of someone with an opposing viewpoint. And usually this is someone outside of their normal area of influence of the protagonist as well. Your basic evil sorcerer in the far off castle, working against a child of prophecy, but not being directly affected by them, Voldemort and such. And last, there's the world through line, the story of how all of this is changing the world at large. Through lines are a key to the success of places like Pixar, who use this structure for all of their films. It is, of course, entirely possible to tell a story that does not use a full set of through lines. There are a number of perfectly good films that are quote unquote incomplete, and there's a big difference between a tale and a story, and that's a distinction that I won't really be going into today, but which you can find plenty of resources about online, if you aren't already familiar. But the point I'm trying to make is that while you can certainly tell a story that does not use a complete set of through lines, usually the absence of a full set is an indicator of a film that just feels like it's missing something. And I do also want to note very strongly that this is simply one style of storytelling. This formula is great, but there are many other ways of doing things. This is pretty much just the way that Hollywood approaches things, and you'll find films from all over the world that don't bother to follow this, and none of them are any lessened for their adherence to other schools of thought. I'm not here today to say this is the one true path, but merely to adapt this popular technique into the world of video game workflow. But now, back on track. So, we have 2 important pieces of information about film structure. 1, intensity progresses linearly over time. 2, Through lines are representative of how you're telling your story from different views. So essentially, a story can be represented by a set of lines. Each line is a thread, so you have your protagonist thread and your antagonist thread, and you have the world's thread and a series of smaller threads that represent the relationship your character has with each of the side characters. Effectively, each of these is a straight line because they have a start, a middle, and an end. There also is a second dimension to them because even within the little stories about side characters, you generally get a ramp up of an intensity as you discover who that character is and what they represent to the overall narrative. But with all of this, we have a problem. And that problem is time. Because you see, there's this pesky thing about games where they have to be played. So for a game to be played requires a player, and players do not respect time. I remember very distinctly the first time I played Beyond Two Souls, I was in a car right outside a big climactic mission. It was raining. This is an important moment the game had been building to for some time, and I had to go inside that building before an interdimensional war started or whatever the hell was happening in the story. And I say that in such a cavalier way because I didn't do that. Because it was dinner time and I was hungry. Because I'm a contrary little jerk who doesn't like to take the game seriously, I let my character, unpaused, stand out in the rain for 30 minutes while I just made dinner. Just standing there. The world was going to die from psychic ghosts in 5 minutes, but I just stood there making dinner because time is broken. And to some degree, we just have to live with that. There's another example that I like to use, where in the recent PS4 title Control, I died at the end of the ashtray maze. Now, if you've played the game, you'll know that the ashtray maze is this really beautiful linear sequence that feels absolutely incredible to play. If you haven't tried it, I totally recommend it. It's great, honestly. And despite the story, it really is. But I died right before the end of that. Now, imagine if you're watching Star Wars, and just as Luke fires his photon torpedo, the film skips back to the beginning of the whole trench run. How awful would that be? And yet we do that in games all the time. And honestly, what's the alternative? Control is one of the most brilliant games of this decade, and what could it have done differently? At the end of the day, even my suggestions here don't actually offer a complete answer, but I think I can point us in the right direction at least. So we have these lines. All of them are a map of intensity over time. Within each relationship, within our character, within the world as a whole, there is a progression of intensity over time. As time in a film moves forward, the film becomes more intense. As we explore each relationship, that relationship culminates in a moment of increased intensity. But in games, time is broken. So, how do we make ourselves less reliant on time? Well, we go back to that chart that I started off with. Remember what I said about the part of this chart that's useful. The vertical lines here represent moments. Each moment is an increase in intensity over the last moment, leading up to the climax and then into the denouement. So let's isolate those moments and put them into a pile. And let's keep them in a pile while we go off on another tangent. I played Outer Wilds a few months ago, finally, and it's absolutely brilliant. What a fantastic open world game that is. So you're given this huge sandbox and you have all these toys to explore, and it's honestly one of my favorite games of all time now. I love how you can openly explore space and track down clues, and how like as you find them, they're all so esoteric and weird, and you can just go into the Ash Twins right away, and it's this crazy hourglass thing, and you have to find all these buried tunnels on the one planet, and there are all these towers being slowly revealed on the other, and you can explore all of this without any clue as to why any of it means anything to anything. It's pretty cool. Um, so I love how many times that I spent going into Dark Bramble, just trying to explore all the different combinations of things, just in this little like ball of nothing before I even had any of the clues as to why I needed to be there or what it was for. And it's just really cool. And that's the brilliance of Outer Wilds. Despite being literally about time and using time as a core mechanic, Outer Wilds does not respect linear time. Outer Wilds does not care when you go, where, or what you do before or after. You can spend an entire lifetime inside of Dark Bramble until you run out of oxygen, get eaten by aliens, or, whatever. It doesn't matter. Because at no point does Outer Wilds tell you a story linearly. And yet it does. Because Outer Wilds has a full set of through lines. And they look like this. The map of information in Outer Wilds reveals itself to you over time as you play. Each time you find a new clue, that clue is represented in your ship's computer. Each of those clues is categorized as being particularly relevant to this piece of the puzzle or that piece of the puzzle. Notice in the photo, these topics are color coordinated. It doesn't matter what order you get the clues in. The clues just exist in the world as part of the environment. If you scan this particular spot, you'll get this particular clue. The NPCs might move around a bit and their daily lives go along, but NPCs always know a set amount of information and can convey that information to you if you ask the right questions. And all of this information is represented in this graph. But it could just as easily be represented on this one. And if Outer Wilds story beats can be collected non-linearly, then there must be a way of reassembling these broken bits of story. And that's where we finally return to the very first question I asked. What is the purpose of linear time? And the answer to that question is this. Time is a key. Information is being kept from us, and the only way to access it is through time. If we're simply told what happens to Voldemort at the end of the Harry Potter books, it lacks impact. We need to know all the things that came before that battle, before the final battle can satisfy. This is why spoilers bother people so much, because information is locked behind a time commitment, and a spoiler is someone else opening it with their own key. If we're given the information without earning the key to it, the experience rings hollow. So, if time is a key, experience is a lock. In a video game, we simply have to switch out those elements. Instead of information being locked behind the amount of time you've been playing the game, as it is in film, the solution here is to lock information behind other things. In Outer Wilds, information is locked behind other information. I can go into the heart of the Ash Twins at any time if I know how to get there, but I don't. Not until I find all the clues that lead up to it, and those other clues act as keys for the locks needed to progress. But that's not the only way to do this. Video games have a long and storied history with lock and key mechanics. In fact, there's an entire genre of games built around them. Technically multiple, if you want to argue. Samus cannot open this door until she has a super missile. That's a pretty effective lock and key. And her games are built around a progression of slowly accumulating keys, each of which opens a new lock. There are other games that do this in other ways as well. RPGs will lock content behind time, but they'll do it in the form of experience points. RTS games will lock content behind tech trees, so you have to build certain things before you can build other things. Even racing games have locks and keys as you're required to beat a course in a certain amount of time before unlocking a certain track or paint job or whatever. The industry of games is filled with people who are experts at designing locks and keys. And what I'm proposing is that information is simply one more thing that can be designed in this way. So now is when I explain how to actually do that. And in order to explain it, I'm going to use an example that is not from games at all. For today's example, I'm going to break apart the Disney movie Moana. I'm choosing Moana because every element of the film is built around a central idea. That idea is, who am I? Also, because Moana is a fun movie to watch, even if it's been spoiled for you for a little bit, although I will avoid doing that as best I can. So, Moana's story is a coming-of-age story, as she first questions who she's supposed to be. Her dad tries to prevent her from leaving the island because he'd once tried to be the person she's trying to be, and he failed at great personal cost. Her grandmother knows exactly who she is and has had to accept herself despite being labeled as the village crazy lady. Maui, the shapeshifter, has lived his entire life for external validation, never once asking himself who he wanted to be because he just wanted to be what everyone else wanted him to be. Tamatoa has entirely avoided the question of who am I, putting on a show to convince everyone else of who he is, hiding his true self behind a gaudy shell. Teika's sense of self was stolen from her, leaving her bitter and angry. It's a very succinct story overall, and it serves our purposes perfectly. You can easily substitute this with just about any other Disney movie. I just choose Moana. So, here's your through lines. Moana's story follows her as she fails to fit in on her island, leading her to sneak off alone. She travels to find Maui and uses his help to return the heart of Te Fiti. On the way, she must help Maui to find his magical hook. Once they do that, they go to Te Fiti and battle Te Kā. After a failed attempt at this battle, Moana almost turns back, but she realizes the call she's been following has been within her all along, and going back would not accomplish anything and thus leave her dissatisfied. So, knowing what she must do, she turns around and returns the heart to Te Fiti. That is the protagonist's through line. Those are the events that happen directly to Moana. So let's look at a few other characters. Moana's grandmother is Moana's mentor. Her arc is to show Moana that it's okay to be yourself, no matter what others might say. Moana's grandmother sends Moana on her way very early in the film and only returns for a moment near the end to give Moana a little encouragement. And that is her entire arc. She serves as a mentor, simply offering advice at critical moments. Moana's father is Moana's foil. He is trying to save her from herself and the dangers that come with self exploration. He loves her and wants her to be safe, so he tries to keep her from getting hurt, and in doing so, he prevents her from accepting herself. His story is one that Moana must learn to overcome. Maui is a sort of antagonist. His entire goal in life has been to do whatever he thinks will impress the mortals in a bid to gain acceptance among them. He wants nothing more than to get his hook and to stay miles away from the heart, Te Fiti, and his past. Moana must overcome his reluctance to be himself as a metaphor for her own internal struggles. Te Kā is a fairly minor role in the story, but she shows what happens when you lose yourself. She is a warning to Moana of what might be. As the story progresses, we also see how the islands are being taken over by a black rot that kills all life. Losing the heart of Te Fiti has put the world in danger, and as our story progresses, we see that danger spread. Te Fiti's lost heart has also caused the seas to be filled with greedy monsters, all seeking the heart for their own. Each of these is a thread. Each of them ramp up in intensity over time. Even Te Kā, though she is barely present before the end of the movie, slowly ramps up from the beginning when she is first mentioned in a story to scare children. Each character's beats slowly increase the level of intensity of their particular story while doing the same thing cumulatively for the story overall. Each mini story is composed of multiple beats. Each beat increases in intensity over time. A film will play each of these beats in an order that the editor thinks works the best, and each through line wraps up at a different time, giving us a series of smaller stories to keep us excited to watch more. So, to make the game version of Moana, you have to take all of these individual story beats and organize them. But how? Well, first you have to sort them out. Some of this information is absolutely critical. You can't possibly tell the story of Moana meeting Maui and saving Te Fiti if she never meets Maui and never reaches Te Fiti. Those important moments become your touchstones. I call these gates. These will often be transitions between acts, but maybe they're at the end of each dungeon or whatever your game does to mark progress. Point being, you put gates in between each major part of your story because the only way to continue through the story is to pass through the gates. Now, I've actually misrepresented this movie in this graphic for the sake of explaining things very generally. Uh, while it's impossible to tell the story without meeting Maui, and I put that as the first gate on the screen. It's not the first gate in the film, because Moana actually has to leave her island before she could ever even meet Maui in the first place. So Moana has what I call subgates. These are moments within an act that must be reached and which change the flow of the story, but aren't full act breaks. Or maybe they are, and you want to consider this movie to have like 5 or 6 acts, but live your dreams. Uh, Here are the real gates for Moana, as far as I'm concerned. So to start with, we have to front load a little bit of information. Moana lives on an island. She grew up there. She wants to leave. And this is a conflict between her and her father and his wishes for her life. That's the first thing that we have to pass through. This is sort of the Star Wars text scroll or the opening cutscene of your game, usually just a brief set the scene moment. After that, we get into Act 1. And so we begin on Motunui, where Moana's story actually starts. So if we were making a game, the whole island could sort of be our starting point. We can explore the island openly, but we can't leave it just yet. So all the information we need about Moana's father, mother, grandmother, village life, etc., that all exists on this island. Players can explore here until they run out of things to learn or really just feel like leaving. We don't really need to care. What we do care about is tracking the information that they've learned and knowing if they've gotten whatever requisite keys, be that information, items, abilities, etc. And once they do, then we unlock the storehouse of boats and allow them to leave the island. The scene where we get those boats should include the promise to found Maui in the heart and probably a good scream or two from Dad. And this could be either a cutscene or a linear story sequence. It doesn't really matter too much as long as the story is conveyed. Now, if we wanted to go the sort of outer wilds, completely open world route, the interior of the cave could act as a sort of miniature act. It's like a very small version of the island as a whole. So you could explore the cave and see what's there. Kind of allow your players to learn their history and about the other characters that are in that cave and the things that are relevant to the story thus far, all in a very open way at whatever pace they would like. That would be kind of the more open world way of doing it. But so the essential information here is that Moana's unhappy on the island, but she stays there out of a sense of obligation. And that's the information for Gate 1. Before we reach Gate 1, we can sprinkle the island with things to learn about her relationships with her family, relationship with the village, etc. And in the film, we get scenes about her doing all sorts of different tasks, village chief and training stuff. And in the game, we could probably do something very similar, but as side quests and such. We probably have a bunch more of those sorts of moments in a game because we don't know, which ones the player will see or won't see. So we want to have some extra stuff to pad it out just in case. But the point here is that each quest on the island should in some way reinforce Moana's dissatisfaction, just as each scene in the film does the same, because that's the major plot point here. Moana's dad wants to protect her from her desire to leave. Her grandmother wants her to be herself and do whatever she wants to do. Everything in the act is pushing the idea that Moana is unhappy. And the only way that she can solve this problem is by taking a very dangerous leap of faith. I would go so far as to say that even the gameplay here in this sequence should reinforce this idea in some way. Everything Moana does here should make her miserable. Every person here reminds her of her discontent, and every action she takes should do the same. So, Act 2 starts when she must leave the island and strike out on her own. At this point, we explore outside the island for the first time, and this is an exploration of Moana and her abilities on the open seas. The game must reinforce that Moana is here to learn about herself. She must also learn that she can't entirely make it on her own. This sequence is primarily about Moana exploring who she is on her own, and players exploring the mechanics of sailing is a pretty great analogy for that. I'm imagining there's a safe space where she can explore and be herself, but outside of that safe space lies all the horrifying sea monsters chasing the heart. She must find Maui if she wants to stand a chance against them. This safer space should be the quest all about Moana and finding the limits of what she can accomplish on her own. Every quest, every story element, everything here should echo this one singular point. At some point, there must be a subgate where we find Maui and go into the ocean once more, but this time for real. Here, we learn about who Maui is and what he wants. The quests here are about him trying to sabotage her quest and how she has to learn to persevere. It's all about proving to Moana how much she wants this. Maui endlessly tries to sabotage her quest during this sequence, and we could have a series of quests where Maui gives her bad information and sends her to places away from Te Fiti, just as long as we reinforce the idea that Moana must truly want to be who she claims she wants to be, because she's going to have to fight for it. The next subgate in Act 2 is getting the hook and the battle with Tamatoa. Here we see a character who's decided to put on a facade instead of working on themselves. Tamatoa has decided to present himself as the person he wants to be to fool everyone else around him rather than actually dealing with his interior self and becoming that person. And this serves as a sort of warning to Moana. It would be great if the gameplay here could reinforce this idea in some way. Moana is fighting Tamatoa's lies by exposing who he really is underneath through her actions. Either way, here we fight and reclaim the hook, which brings us to the next sequence. Before we find Maui's hook, the game is all about exploring and learning to be Moana. After we find the hook, the focus is on Maui and him learning to be Maui, as well as how that reflects Moana's journey. This might be a fun place to allow the player to switch characters and learn a new set of skills as Maui, since echoing gameplay echoes the theme nicely. This section must be about Moana teaching the lessons she's learned about herself thus far, and realizing that she has a very strong sense of self if she would just allow herself to see it. The last gate is reaching the island of Te Fiti, and it's here that we must reach our lowest point. Maui's hook breaks, he flies away, we're repelled from the island of Te Fiti, and we lose all hope and almost go home in this sequence. This is a good spot where robbing players of that newfound Maui gameplay can really drive home the narrative. Although, obviously, that has gameplay ramifications, and if this were an actual production, would need to be a whole series of meetings. I accept that. But so, in this section, we probably condensed the gameplay to be all centered around the area of Te Fiti instead of being quite so open a world. And we have to convey those narrative beats and then allow Moana to realize her need to do all of this no matter the cost. This sequence is about Moana finally accepting who she is and has always been, and learning to trust herself, even without Maui. It's critical that this section contrasts the Act 2 section where she felt unable to progress without Maui's help. This section is probably a series of scouting missions or something to find a way past Taka, and then a final boss fight where we must confront her and sneak our way through. To be honest, this section can get a little complex in terms of conveying gameplay, a story through gameplay. And if I were running this game production, I'd probably do this by setting it all up much earlier. Perhaps having a quest marker that refuses to clear off can demonstrate that Moana needs to do this for herself, but that only works if there's some sort of like a manual gameplay mechanic of clearing off your quest markers at certain times. But anyway, point being, this is a culmination of everything that came before, and as such, you have to weave this moment of realization into the core loop in some way, or it'll just kind of fall flat. Once we get through to Te Fiti, it's the final boss, as we would try to restore the heart, or I mean, it could just be a cutscene, I suppose. If we do want to echo the film more directly, we can go that route. But I kind of think it's a boss fight here. It would be a more engaging way to making the player like earn the restoration of the heart more. Well, I do acknowledge that that kind of flies in the face of Te Fiti's motivation. So this would be another series of meetings probably. But either way, that is all of Moana. And I want to be clear here that I don't really think Moana's story is particularly fit to making a game out of. The gameplay of Moana would have to be all about exploration of the ocean. The story is all about the who am I, and so those two things are a little bit of a disconnect. Now we can obviously tie those things together a bit and make the exploration of the ocean a metaphor for the exploration of Moana as herself. But the problem is that we very quickly begin to kind of rewrite large sections of the game, of the story. So, for instance, Te Fiti's goal is to get the heart. but there's no reason to fight Moana unless the final boss fight happens before the narrative climax in the film. And if the gameplay climax and the story climax are in two completely different moments of time, we've kind of lost the entire purpose of this talk. So similarly, the fight with Tamatoa isn't narratively motivated in a game since there's like we're only really there to get the hook, and there's no metaphorical struggle to echo the gameplay struggle. So we'd want some element of that moment to kind of be changed a little bit. And even worse, the biggest moment that doesn't work for me is Moana's moment of self-realization. She sees the call is coming from inside her, and she understands that she must do this, even if that means doing it on her own. But there's not really any way to convey that through gameplay, at least not in the way that's represented in the film, which is fine because games shouldn't try to be films necessarily. But all of this just means that the two things are different. One, it doesn't quite work as a game one to one, and that's just something you have to deal with. But that's not really the point that I'm trying to make with this talk anyway. But the point that I am trying to make, however, is that, well, we have this graph that I've made, but we haven't exactly tied it all to the rest of the story and what I've been saying this whole time, at least not directly. Maybe you've connected the dots, maybe not, but I want to walk through it either way. I use the word gate for a very specific reason, because gates require keys. So in Moana, we've got this series of specific gates and this series of information that's not tied to a gate. The separation of information is critical. This all maps quite nicely to the original pacing graph I showed, which, of course it does. That original graph was 4 films. But do you remember this image? Well, I'll remind you now that time is broken. We can't really do linear in games, but we also have to do linear in games. Stories are inherently linear. There's always going to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. Even if your game is something like Binding of Isaac or some other game where you have to die over and over again countless times, you restart it all from scratch. Well, there is always some sense of progression, and you always unlock new areas and new information as you play through the game. And thus, there is always the linear. We can't avoid that while telling a story. But what we can do is tear out as much of that linearity as possible. And that's what I've been doing throughout this talk. So now we have these tent poles of our story, these touchstones, these immutable moments that must be conveyed for the story to make sense. These gates. Once we know where to put the gates, we fill in the rest of our story with the floating points. Only the gates are fixed points. Only the gates must be passed through. Everything else is optional. Everything else is fluid. Everything else is interactive. This way, we make more of our game about the gameplay, and we don't rob the player of the ability to play nearly as often, because play is the focus, play is why they're here at all. So by allowing the player to play the game, you give up a little bit of control. However, by understanding where these fixed gates must exist, you regain a bit of that control and can adjust when information is available to the player. Motunui isn't accessible to Moana after she leaves, so every side quest on that island can reinforce a singular point for the narrative. We know that while the player is present on Motunui, that they are also present within Act 1 of our story, and thus we can only give them information that conveys the point of that act. Every single element of the island tells us that Moana is miserable and has this need inside of herself to be more than who she is. She wants to understand herself desperately, and knowing this theme and having a specific location to focus on it are essential. Once you leave the island, the themes change, and your gameplay must adapt to conveying the new theme. And so, all of that leads me into my next big point. All of this structure can map directly onto your world. Act 1 of Moana exists entirely on her island. Act 2 exists entirely at sea. And we can split up Act 2 into distinct sections between when Moana is exploring a small part of the ocean by herself, and when Maui joins her and gives her the ability to explore the rest of the ocean full of horrible monsters. Act 3 tightens things back up again, focusing on the island of Tafiti. All those story beats we need to cover can dot the landscape or seascape, as it were. And if a player is in location X, we know that information Y is available to them there. If this were a more open world, we could still control the pacing of information available by tracking which gates the player had passed through. Knowing that there are 4 specific touchstone moments means that it's relatively easy to know when to change all of the side information for the sake of reinforcing themes. Maybe this particular bookcase doesn't give you anything new during Act 1 of your game, but once you hit Act 2, you notice that there's a hidden book there or whatever. That's kind of a bad example, but hopefully you get the idea. This is something that open world games do very frequently. So, Spider Man for the PS4 changes the enemy spawns as you progress through your story, for example. What we don't see much of is the same concept applied to narrative elements. Spider Man's story is told through a bunch of gates, and everywhere between those gates has basically nothing to do with the gates. They have the touchstones idea implemented very firmly, but they don't use the gameplay space to tell their story between kind of beyond the idea that the villains are more and more in control, and thus enemies are more and more powerful. And this is fine because Spider-Man team made a great game. I certainly don't intend to insult them. I'm simply pointing out that even at the highest levels, games as a whole aren't really thinking about their stories in the way that films think about theirs. We think about our gameplay as and our story as 2 different things, while a film will focus every audio, visual, and every other element into a laser focus. So this is what I think we can take away from films as a medium. We can't be as linear as films are, and honestly, I don't think we should be trying. Time is broken for us, so let's not even try to fix it. Instead, let's accept the players as agents of chaos that they are. Unfortunately, doing so does have some difficulties in adapting these ideas to interactive media. For instance, it's rather difficult to increase our intensity over time if we don't know where the player will be at any particular time. If all of our beats are available simply over the course of an act and each of them is out in the world to be collected at will, it can be very difficult to understand how to maintain a cohesive feeling for our story. For that, we must understand the idea that every part of our story can be treated as if it were made from the same building blocks. What works for the whole story works equally well for individual elements of the story. We can put gates within a character's arc just as easily as we can put them for the whole world. Each through line can have a set of gates within it. Each time you collect a particular key, you can use that key to unlock any gates associated with it. It's possible that learning to double jump not only means you can get to level 3, but also means you can reach the attic in your mother's house, and now you can find out the dark family secret she had hidden there. Doing this unlocks new dialogue or gameplay or whatever, and thus advances your storyline with your mother. This can be true for every element of your story, and as you progress, you'll gain access to the more intense part of your stories rather naturally. One thing I noticed while playing Outer Wilds is that each individual clue that leads you forward was a rather flat moment narratively. They were all kind of just clues. The increase in intensity came from your own feeling that you were getting closer and closer to the big reveal, and that you'd be able to solve this problem if you just had that one missing piece. And with that, I have this graphic. Here, we see the overall story of Moana. We see those gate moments that are immutable, mixed in throughout a series of open world spaces. We can match the themes to the parts of the story where those themes must be present. We can break down all of this into smaller sub-themes in places where there are smaller gates that we must pass through and which can change those themes. And throughout all of this, we can keep track of our plot points. We can map out our quests and where they belong in our structure. We can keep account of whether we are adequately reinforcing the themes of an act we're in, or if we're overloading the player with information that applies to the whole world instead. Notice I've included that as a 4th circle here. The purple represents all those books and such you find out in the open world, which never change. It's important to be aware of those as they do affect the pacing of your story. You could also put circles around Acts 1 and 2 if you had quests available during both of those acts, but not Act 3, or the other way around if you like. This chart is sort of a fractal. You could have a full chart just like this inside of each one of those little dots, representing the specific moments of your story. And of course, I don't expect everyone here to use my graphics, but the color coding concept could be used in a spreadsheet relatively easily. Also note that these dots represent our through lines. We can isolate just the arc for Moana's grandmother and check that our pacing is giving us information about her at appropriate times. We can then compare that to the other threads in the same way to understand that our game is giving us a variety of information all throughout. We can't control if or when a player will see these different threads, but at least we can know that the options are available. The variety is there. And that, I believe, is the key to adapting film's formula to video games. We cannot control the player, so we must put as much information as possible for them to find, and we must know that no matter what they find, that it will always be relevant. To offer specific suggestions on how to accomplish this goal, it's entirely possible to have each through line be tied to an integer value that ticks up every time you experience it. So the first thing you learn about your grandmother is always the first thing you learn about your grandmother. The second thing is always the second thing, etc. But maybe where you learn those things can be different based on like how you explore and how you play the game. There's also the Outer Wilds take on this problem, which is to fill the world with redundant clues to ensure that no matter where you go, there will always be something pointing you in the right direction. Either way is fine. The goal is the same. You want an increase in intensity over time. You want this for every single one of your plot threads, and you want this no matter how your player explores the world. Usually, this is quite a difficult set of balls to juggle, but if you break it all down into much smaller pieces, they become easier and easier to handle. If you can isolate just one single thread of your story and understand when parts of it are available to the player and how likely they are to see it, you can pace that section with a high degree of specificity. If you can do this with each of your plot threads, managing your pacing will become much easier, even in complex stories. The goal of all of this is to understand our game's pacing. We want to control our set piece moments, but to let go of that control everywhere else. Control the gates, let the player wander freely between them. By understanding the reasons that film use the formula that they use, we can break free from their linear techniques and learn to adapt to our own medium's needs. For instance, I mentioned several times this idea of telling the story of Moana through quest markers or gameplay mechanics directly. And this sort of mechanical storytelling is something I've explored extensively on my own, and something I intend to dive deeper into going forward. Feel free to check out my blog or follow me on Twitter for more on those topics, because those are sort of talks unto themselves, if not several. And with that, that's all from me for the day. Hopefully, you can see how these concepts I've discussed could be useful for your own productions. And I've left some time here for questions, as I have this pretty horrible habit of missing obvious points that I really should have explained earlier. But before I open up for questions, however, I'd like to also mention that everything I've discussed here works perfectly in tandem with Emily Short's storylit concept. And so I fully recommend her blog as a great place of learning from someone who's just way better at the narrative design thing than I am. And if you'd like to reach out to me for any reason, my email is open. My Twitter is small enough that I haven't been scared straight by the internet yet, and so feel free to fill my inbox and cure me of all of my delusions. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to any questions you may have.